The morning light filtered through the oak trees that lined the eastern edge of my property as I sipped coffee on the front porch. These oaks were planted by my grandfather the year my father was born. Now they stood tall and proud, just like the legacy of this land. My farm was not just acreage on a deed. It was history written in soil and stone. Every fence post had a story. Every field held memories of harvests past, and the weathered barn had witnessed 3 generations of family triumphs and hardships. I had grown up learning to respect the land. My father would take my small hand in his rough, calloused one and show me how to feel the soil, how to tell when it was ready for planting. "This land does not belong to us, son," he would say. "We belong to it. We are just its caretakers for a time." Those words shaped my understanding of what it meant to be a farmer, a landowner, a steward of something greater than myself. The farm had always been peaceful, isolated enough to give us privacy, but close enough to town for convenience. That changed 2 years ago when developers purchased the old miller's property half a mile down the road. They cleared the forest and erected cookie-cutter homes with postage-stamp yards. I did not mind progress. People need places to live, and the millers had every right to sell. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the new development would try to extend its reach beyond its borders. I remember the first letter clearly. It arrived in an official-looking envelope with Lakeside Community Homeowners Association, printed in gold embossing across the top. I opened it at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside me as I read through bureaucratic language about community standards and neighborhood beautification initiatives. The letter stated that my property was now subject to HOA guidelines and demanded immediate compliance with their regulations regarding exterior maintenance and landscaping. I laughed out loud. My farm predated their development by almost a century. The idea that some newly formed association could suddenly claim authority over my land was absurd. I tossed the letter into the recycling bin and went about my day, assuming it was a clerical error that would sort itself out. Perhaps they had misunderstood where their boundaries ended and mine began. An honest mistake, nothing more. 3 more letters arrived over the next month, each more insistent than the last. The final one contained a warning. Failure to comply with HOA standards will result in enforcement actions as permitted by county regulations. I still did not take it seriously. My land was not part of their planned community. It never had been. I had the deeds to prove it. Their threats were meaningless, or so I thought. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I had spent the morning in town delivering produce to the local market and picking up supplies. As I turned onto the long gravel road leading to my farmhouse, I noticed unusual activity near my front pasture. 3 white vans were parked along the road, and men in matching uniforms were unloading materials from them. Long coils of wire glinted in the afternoon sun. I pulled my truck over and approached the workers, confused but not yet alarmed. "What is going on here?" I asked the nearest man, who was hammering a metal post into what was unquestionably my land. "Installing security fencing," he replied without looking up. "HOA contract." "There must be some mistake," I said. "This is my property. I never authorized any fencing." The man finally stopped hammering and looked at me with indifference. "Look, mister, we are just following orders. Got the work order right here." He pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket. "Lakeside HOA authorized this installation along the designated property line." I examined the paper. Sure enough, there was a crude map showing a fence line that cut through what had always been the entrance to my farm. "This is incorrect," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "This land has been in my family for generations. It is not part of Lakeside." The worker shrugged. Not my problem, sir. We are just doing what we were hired to do. If you have got issues, take it up with the HOA. I need you to stop work immediately, I insisted. This is trespassing. Cannot do that without authorization from the client, he said, turning back to his task. But here. He handed me a business card with the HOA office address and contact information. The president's name is Karen Whitfield. She handles all the enforcement issues. I stood there, watching in disbelief as they continued installing what I now realized was an electric fence. Metal posts were being driven into my soil every 10 feet, with warning signs proclaiming property boundary electrified attached to each one. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of aggression. That afternoon, I drove directly to the address on the card, a small office in a strip mall near the entrance to the lakeside development. The reception area was decorated in muted grays and blues, with framed photographs of perfect houses with perfect lawns lining the walls. A young woman at the front desk looked up as I entered. I need to speak with Karen Whitfield immediately, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. Do you have an appointment? She asked. No, but there are people putting an electric fence on my property right now, and I was told she authorized it. The receptionist's expression did not change. Please have a seat. I will see if Ms. Whitfield is available. 20 minutes later, a door opened and a woman emerged. Karen Whitfield was exactly what I had expected. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer clothes, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She extended a manicured hand, which I did not take. Mr. Johnson, I understand you have concerns about our compliance measures, she said, gesturing for me to follow her into her office. Once inside, she took a seat behind an immaculate desk and motioned for me to sit across from her. I remained standing. Those are not compliance measures, I said. That is an electric fence being installed on my property without my permission. I want it removed immediately. Karen's smile never faltered. There seems to be some confusion about property boundaries, Mr. Johnson. According to our records and the new community expansion plan, your front acreage falls within our jurisdiction. That is impossible, I said. My family has owned that land for over 90 years. Yes, well, she said, opening a folder on her desk. Things change. The county approved our community expansion last month, and your property is now officially part of the Lakeside District. That means you are required to comply with our homeowner guidelines. I leaned forward, placing my hands on her desk. You cannot just redraw boundaries and claim my land. Karen's smile tightened. I assure you, everything is perfectly legal. The fence is being installed to clearly delineate the new boundaries and ensure compliance. You will receive a comprehensive guide to our community standards, which your property must meet within 30 days. As I left her office, stunned and furious, I knew this was only the beginning of a battle I never asked for but could not afford to lose. My land, my legacy, my freedom to live as I always had, all of it was suddenly under threat from people who measured success in uniform lawn heights and regulation mailbox colors. But they had made a critical mistake. They thought I would simply accept their authority without question, bow to their rules without resistance. They had no idea how deeply my roots ran in this soil, or how fiercely I would fight to protect what was mine. The morning after discovering the fence, I contacted the county records office. If Karen and her HOA had somehow legally annexed my land, there would be documentation. I needed facts, not just her smug assurances that everything was perfectly legal. The county clerk, an older woman named Marge who had known my family for years, seemed surprised by my questions. No, "There has not been any approved boundary change for your property, Frank," she said, peering at me over her reading glasses. "Let me check the permit records for that fence, though. They would need proper authorization for a structure like that, especially an electrified one." I waited as Marge typed methodically on her computer, occasionally clicking through different screens. After several minutes, she shook her head. "There is nothing here," she said. "No permits filed for fence construction on or adjacent to your property, not by the HOA or anyone else." "So they are installing an unpermitted electric fence?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "It appears that way. Would you like to file a formal complaint? I can get you the paperwork." I completed the necessary forms while Marge made copies of my deed and property survey for my records. By the time I left the county office, I had a folder full of documentation proving that my land remained independent of the Lakeside HOA, and that their fence was being constructed without proper permits or authority. That afternoon, I returned to my property with my phone camera ready. I documented every post, every wire, every warning sign they had installed. I took photos of the work vans with the company name clearly visible, and even managed to get pictures of workers continuing the installation despite the lack of permits. The fence now extended almost a quarter-mile, cutting off direct access to my front fields and main driveway. As I was photographing a particularly intrusive section that blocked access to my equipment shed, one of my neighbors from down the road pulled up. Jim Clark had lived adjacent to the old miller's property before the development took over, and now his modest home was surrounded by lakeside houses on 3 sides. "They got you too, huh?" he said, stepping out of his truck. "What do you mean, too?" I asked. Jim sighed, leaning against his truck. "They have been pulling this stuff for months now, claiming property lines are different than what the deeds say, issuing fines for violations of rules we never agreed to follow. I lost 20 feet of my backyard to their community green space because I could not afford the lawyer to fight it." "But how are they getting away with this?" I asked. "They have money and connections," Jim said simply. "Karen's husband is on the county zoning board. Not officially, of course. He is a consultant. But nothing happens without their approval." This information made my blood run cold. If what Jim was saying was true, this was not just incompetence or misunderstanding. It was corruption, plain and simple. 2 days later, I received a notice of an emergency HOA meeting to address community border security concerns. Despite not being a member of their association, I decided to attend. I needed to understand what they were telling people about the fence and my property. The meeting was held in the Lakeside Community Center, a modern building with vaulted ceilings and wall-to-wall windows overlooking an artificial lake. About 50 residents were already seated when I arrived. I recognized several faces from town, but did not know any of them personally. I took a seat in the back row as Karen Whitfield approached the podium. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "As many of you know, we have been implementing our border security plan to ensure the safety and property values of our community. Phase 1 of the fencing project is now complete along the northern boundary." She clicked a button, and a map appeared on the screen behind her. To my shock, it showed my entire front acreage labeled as Lakeside Community Land. "I am pleased to report that the adjacent property owner has agreed to our terms," Karen continued, her voice smooth as silk. "In fact, Mr. Johnson attended our planning meeting last month and signed off on the boundary adjustments." I stood up immediately. "That is a lie," I called out, my voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "I never attended any planning meeting. I never signed anything. and I certainly never agreed to have an illegal electric fence installed on my property. All eyes turned to me as Karen's professional demeanor momentarily faltered. She recovered quickly, her smile returning as she addressed the crowd. "Mr. Johnson is understandably emotional about the changes," she said. "Change can be difficult, especially for those with outdated perspectives on property usage. However, I have the minutes from the meeting right here, with his signature acknowledging the new boundaries." She held up a document, too distant for anyone to actually read. I marched down the aisle toward the podium. "May I see that?" I demanded. Karen hesitated, then handed me the paper with obvious reluctance. I scanned it quickly, finding what purported to be my signature at the bottom of a page outlining mutually agreed boundary modifications. It was not my handwriting, not even close. "This is forgery," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have never seen this document before and I did not sign it." "Mr. Johnson, please," Karen said, reaching for the paper, which I held firmly out of her reach. "This is not the appropriate forum for your personal grievances. If you have concerns, you can schedule an appointment with my office." "I have already been to your office," I replied. "You lied to me there, and you are lying to everyone here now. The county has no record of any boundary changes to my property, and there are no permits for the fence you installed." A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen quickly took control again, her voice sharp now. "Security, please escort Mr. Johnson out. He is disrupting our meeting." Two men in blazers approached me. I handed the forged document to the nearest resident, a middle-aged woman who looked genuinely concerned about what was unfolding. "Look at this," I told her. "Compare it to any legal document with my actual signature. This is fraud." As the security guards led me toward the exit, I turned to address the room one last time. "That fence is illegal. It is on my property without permission or permits. Anyone who wants to see the actual county records is welcome to visit me any time." Outside in the parking lot, one of the security guards, a younger man with an apologetic expression, stopped me before I got to my truck. "Listen," he said quietly, glancing back to make sure we were alone. "You are not the only one they have done this to. But nobody fights back because Karen and her board always win. They have deeper pockets than regular folks like us." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because my grandmother lost part of her garden to their beautification project last year. It broke her heart. Someone needs to stand up to them." As I drove home that night, my mind was racing with implications. This was not just a boundary dispute. It was not even just about my land anymore. The HOA was systematically encroaching on properties throughout the area, using forgery, lies, and intimidation to expand their control. And from what Jim and the security guard had told me, no one had successfully challenged them yet. Back at my farm, I stood at the edge of the illegal fence as darkness fell. The warning lights on the electric posts blinked steadily, marking a line that had no right to exist. I thought about my father and grandfather, how they had protected this land through depression and drought, through hard times when selling would have been easier than fighting. They never gave up. Neither would I. But as I turned to walk back to my house, a new realization settled heavily on my shoulders. This would not be a simple matter of proving I was right. The HOA had money, connections, and apparently no qualms about falsifying documents. They had divided my land and installed an illegal fence with impunity. What would they try next? And how many of my neighbors would stand with me when the time came to fight back? The lights of the new lakeside homes glowed in the distance, and for the first time, they did not look like progress. They looked like an advancing army, with Karen Whitfield as their general, moving the boundary lines of her kingdom one electric fence at a time. The day after the HOA meeting, I called an electrician to assess the fence. Bill Mason had done all the electrical work on my farm for 15 years, and I trusted his judgment. He arrived in the early afternoon, his truck kicking up dust on the gravel driveway as he pulled up beside the new fence line. "Never seen anything like this out here, Frank," he said as he examined the control box they had installed. "This is commercial-grade stuff, meant for security facilities, not residential boundaries." Bill walked the fence line, testing voltage at various points with his equipment. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he worked. "This is not right," he finally said, shaking his head. "The voltage is way above what is legal for residential areas, especially with no proper warning signage or safety measures. And look here." He pointed to where the fence crossed a small seasonal creek that ran through my property. "They have electrified sections over water. That is a major safety hazard." "How bad are we talking, Bill?" I asked. He looked me straight in the eye. "Bad enough to kill a small animal, bad enough to seriously injure a child, and definitely dangerous for your livestock." He gestured toward the goat pasture not 30 yards from where we stood. "If one of your animals gets caught in this, it would not be pretty." "Can they even legally run a fence like this without specialized permits?" I asked. "Not in this county," Bill replied. "Commercial-grade electric fencing requires safety inspections, proper grounding systems, warning signs every 50 feet, and definitely cannot cross water sources. Whoever installed this either does not know the regulations or deliberately ignored them." I thanked Bill for his assessment and asked him to send me a formal report documenting all the safety violations. It would be more evidence when I challenged the HOA, which was looking increasingly necessary with each passing day. I did not have to wait long to see Bill's warnings come true. 3 days later, I heard distressed bleating from the pasture near the fence line. I ran outside to find one of my younger goats, a kid not yet 6 months old, tangled in the lower wires of the electric fence. The poor creature was thrashing in panic, receiving shock after shock as it tried to free itself. I grabbed rubber gloves from my truck and carefully freed the terrified animal. It had burns along its side where the wires had made contact, and it trembled violently in my arms as I carried it back to the barn. My hands were shaking too, but not from electricity, from rage. This was exactly what Bill had warned about. The fence was not just an inconvenience or a boundary dispute. It was dangerous. The next morning, I drove directly to the HOA office, the injured goat's photo clearly displayed on my phone. The same receptionist as before looked up as I entered, her expression immediately wary. "I need to speak with Ms. Whitfield," I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. "She is in a meeting," the receptionist replied automatically. "If you would like to make in." "Tell her Frank Johnson is here about the illegal fence that injured my livestock," I interrupted. "And tell her I am not leaving until I speak with her." 20 minutes of tense silence followed before Karen finally emerged from her office, her professional smile firmly in place, despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Johnson," she said coolly, "I understand you are experiencing some difficulties with the community boundary markers." "Boundary markers," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You installed an illegal, high-voltage electric fence that nearly killed one of my animals yesterday." I held up my phone, showing her the photo of the injured goat. Several clients in the waiting area leaned forward to look, their expressions concerned. "That is unfortunate," Karen said, barely glancing at the image. However, proper containment of your livestock is your responsibility, not the association's. That fence is on my property, I said, each word deliberate and clear. It was installed without permits, without inspection, and without my consent. It violates multiple county safety codes, and now it has caused actual harm. Karen's smile tightened. Mr. Johnson, these theatrical displays are unnecessary. If you believe you have a legitimate complaint, I suggest you file it through proper channels. I have filed complaints, I said, with the county, with the permit office, and with the sheriff. But I thought you should know directly that this has gone beyond a property dispute. That fence is dangerous, and I am holding you personally responsible for any further harm it causes. Something in my tone must have finally penetrated her professional veneer, because her smile vanished entirely. Are you threatening me, Mr. Johnson? I am informing you, I corrected. As president of this HOA, you authorized an illegal structure that has now caused injury. That makes you liable. Security, Karen called sharply. Please escort Mr. Johnson from the premises immediately and call the sheriff. He is trespassing and making threats. 2 security guards appeared from a side door, and Karen turned to the startled clients in the waiting area. I apologize for this disruption. This man has been harassing our office over routine community improvements. That was when I lost my composure. Routine improvements. You forged my signature. You installed an illegal fence. You injured my animal, and now you are lying to these people's faces. One of the guards put his hand on my arm. Sir, you need to leave now. Everyone in this room needs to know what this woman is doing, I continued, my voice echoing off the walls. She is fabricating documents. She is violating county regulations. She is stealing land that does not belong to her or this HOA. The security guards were now firmly escorting me toward the door as Karen picked up the phone. Yes, Sheriff. We have a disturbed individual causing a disturbance at the Lakeside HOA office. He is making threats and refusing to leave private property. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the parking lot explaining my side of the story to Deputy Harris, a man I had known casually for years. Frank, you cannot go barging into offices yelling, no matter how justified you might be, he said, though his expression was sympathetic. Ms. Whitfield could press charges for disorderly conduct. She installed an illegal fence that injured my goat Tom, I replied, and she forged my signature on HOA documents. Deputy Harris sighed. Look, I understand you are upset, but this is civil, not criminal. You need to handle this through proper legal channels. And in the meantime, I asked, that dangerous fence stays up and she keeps claiming my land belongs to her HOA. I wish I had better answers for you, he said, but causing scenes is not going to help your case. I drove home in a fog of frustration and helplessness. The next morning, there was a stack of violation notices taped to my mailbox. According to the HOA, I was now being fined for unsightly agricultural equipment visible from community roadways, substandard exterior paint on residential structures, excessive noise from livestock disturbing community residents, unapproved vegetation exceeding height restrictions. Each violation carried a fine of $200 per day until remedied. I had never agreed to HOA governance, yet they were attempting to levy thousands of dollars in fines against me for living, as I always had on my own property. The pressure was relentless. Every day brought new notices, new complaints, new fines. I began avoiding my own front yard, choosing instead to use the back entrance to my property. I stopped waving to the new neighbors who drove past. I found myself lying awake at night, calculating how much money I could lose fighting this battle, wondering if it might be easier to sell the farm and move somewhere else, somewhere without HOAs and Karens with clipboards. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I remembered something my father had mentioned years ago, before he passed. There had been a previous attempt to incorporate our land into a development, back in the 1970s. Dad had fought it then, and won because of some special clause in my grandfather's original deed. The next morning, I went to the attic and pulled out the ancient metal filing cabinet where my father had kept important documents. Hours of searching through yellowed papers finally revealed what I was looking for: the original deed to our property, dated 1934, with a special covenant explicitly stating that the land shall remain agricultural in perpetuity and exempt from any future community incorporation or homeowners association governance, without the express written consent of the current deed holder. I stared at the document, its legal language crystal clear even after all these years. This was it. This was the leverage I needed. My grandfather had the foresight to protect his land from exactly the kind of encroachment I was now facing. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Karen Whitfield had picked the wrong farmer to bully. She thought I would eventually break under the pressure of fines and harassment. She thought I would give up my land rather than continue fighting. She was about to learn how mistaken she had been. I carefully placed the deed in a protective sleeve and made 3 copies, one for my records, one for my lawyer, and one for Karen Whitfield, because I was done being reactive. I was done playing defense. It was time to take back what was mine, one step at a time, starting with that God-forsaken fence. The spark that had been smoldering inside me burst into flame. I had lost sleep. I had lost peace of mind. I had nearly lost one of my animals, but I would not lose my land, not 1 inch of it, not to Karen, not to her HOA, not to anyone. I called Jim Clark and asked if he still had the contact information for the security guard who had spoken to me after the HOA meeting. It was time to build my own alliance, to gather every scrap of evidence I could find, because this was no longer just about defending my property. This was about exposing the truth, about standing up not just for myself, but for everyone who had been bullied by Karen and her association. As I hung up the phone, I looked out the window at the electric fence cutting across my land. That fence was more than wire and electricity. It was a challenge, and I was finally ready to answer it. The morning after discovering my grandfather's deed, I called Thomas Abernathy, a land use attorney who had represented several farmers in the county over the years. His office was small but respectable, lined with law books and framed photos of rural properties he had helped preserve against development. "This covenant is exceptionally clear," he said after examining the deed. "Your grandfather was quite thorough in protecting the land from future incorporation or association control." "So the HOA has no authority over my property?" I asked, needing to hear it confirmed. "None whatsoever," Thomas replied. "Not only that, but the installation of that fence constitutes trespassing and property damage. The forged documents could result in fraud charges, and the animal injury opens them up to additional liability." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by determination. What do we do first? First, we send a formal cease and desist letter demanding immediate removal of the fence and retraction of all fines and claims against your property, Thomas said. We give them 72 hours to comply before we file suit. "And if they ignore it?" I asked. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then we take them to court. But frankly, once their lawyer sees this deed, they would be fools to let it get that far. This kind of covenant is ironclad in our state. The cease and desist letter was delivered to the HOA office by courier the next day, with copies sent to each board member's home address. The letter meticulously outlined the legal standing of my property, the illegality of the fence, the safety violations, the fraudulent documents, and the injury to my livestock. It demanded immediate removal of the fence, a formal retraction of all claims against my property, cessation of all fines, and a written apology. I expected immediate action. What I got was silence. 3 days passed with no response from Karen or the HOA. Thomas called their attorney, who claimed they were reviewing the matter. Meanwhile, the fines continued to accumulate. Notices arrived daily, each more absurd than the last. One actually cited me for unapproved agricultural activities in a residential zone. Then came the construction signs. I drove home one evening to find large orange, road closed, 4 construction barriers blocking the main access road to my farm. There was no construction crew, no equipment, no actual work being done, just barriers preventing me and anyone else from using the most direct route to my property. I called the county road department immediately. The supervisor was baffled. "We did not authorize any closures on that road," he said. "Those are not our barriers." "Then whose are they?" I demanded, "and who put them there?" "Hard to say without seeing them," he replied. "But if they are not official county barriers, anyone who placed them there is obstructing a public roadway, which is illegal." I photographed the barriers, their lack of official county markings, and the completely untouched road they were supposedly protecting. I added these images to my growing file of evidence and sent them to Thomas. "They are getting desperate," he said when I called him. "These delay tactics and harassment patterns suggest they know they are on shaky legal ground, but are hoping you will give up before they have to admit it." "I am not giving up," I said firmly, "but I cannot keep waiting forever while they play these games." "Give me one more day to reach their counsel," Thomas advised. "If we still get no response, we will file an emergency injunction to have the fence removed." That evening I received a call from Jim Clark. "Frank, you need to know something," he said, his voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "There was an HOA meeting tonight. They did not announce it publicly, but my wife cleans the community center and overheard everything." "What did they say?" I asked. "Karen told the board your lawyer's letter was meaningless posturing. She said they have the county in their pocket and that no judge would rule against them because of their political connections. She said they need to increase pressure until you see reason." I thanked Jim for the information and immediately called Thomas to update him. His response was measured but firm. "Document everything. If they are conspiring to continue harassment despite clear legal notice, that strengthens our case considerably." The next day, Thomas called with bad news. "Their attorney is stonewalling us, claims they need more time to investigate the authenticity of your deed. Meanwhile, they filed a counter-motion claiming you are the one harassing them." "That is ridiculous," I exclaimed. "Of course it is," Thomas agreed. "But it accomplishes what they want: delay. The court will not hear our emergency motion until next month because of their objection." I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the electric fence that sliced through my property. My injured goat was recovering but still limped slightly. The road barriers forced me to use a back service road that added 20 minutes to any trip to town. The pile of HOA fines now totaled over $12,000, with new violations added daily. "I cannot wait another month, Thomas," I said quietly. "They are squeezing me from every direction." "I understand your frustration," he replied, but legally, we need to let the process work. After I hung up, I walked out to the fence line. The afternoon sun glinted off the metal wires that hummed with dangerous current. I thought about my grandfather's foresight in creating that covenant. I thought about my father teaching me to protect this land. I thought about all the farmers and landowners who had already given in to Karen's tactics because they could not afford to fight. Something broke inside me then, not in weakness but in clarity. I had tried to do this the right way. I had filed complaints. I had hired a lawyer. I had documented everything. And while I followed the rules, they continued to break them with impunity. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and purchased heavy-duty insulated gloves